Hello and welcome back to the Consistory of the Coelc YouTube channel. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Zabel of St John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. Today we're continuing through my series on women in the church by going through my book, The Role of Female Laity in the Church. And today we're going to be looking at the issue of female lay lectors. And now some people who know the positions of the coelc know that we don't use lay lectors in our church. Now, for those who don't understand exactly what a lay lector is, some people call them lay readers, but lay readers are normally those who lead a lay reading service. I like to use the term "kuster" in the coelc, like the Aldona guys do. Some people might call them lay leaders, but lay readers are normally those who lead a lay reading service, whereas the person that reads the scriptural lessons for the day, like the Bible lessons, that's normally a lay lector. And for those who know the coelc's position and have watched this channel, you know the coelc doesn't use lay lectors, so you're going, well, hold on, Jake, why are you talking about female lay lectors if the coelc doesn't have lay lectors? And the answer to that is actually a twofold answer. Firstly, this book I wrote back in 2017 when I was transitioning out of the Lutheran Church of Australia and into the Australian Evangelical Lutheran Church, and both of those churches do have lay lectors, the LCA using female lay lectors, the AELC restricting it to just male lay lectors. So when I wrote this book, I was writing it in that historical context, but I also do want to talk about this question, for even though the coelc doesn't condone the use of lay lectors in the church, there are churches out there who do use lay lectors, and the point I want to make here is that I don't think you should be having lay lectors, but if you do have lay lectors, they shouldn't be women. They should be at least men if you're going to have them. And so the question is, can women read the scriptures in church, and is this a violation of scripture? Now, the question really comes down to, is reading scripture teaching? Because we've already established that women can't preach and teach in church. But this doesn't mean women can't speak in church, because women can join in the hymn singing, they can join in responsive prayer, they can join in the parts of the liturgy, which are often scripture themselves. So there actually are laity speaking scripture in the church. But the question then comes down to is, are they teaching? And the actual answer to this is generally no. The early Lutherans didn't consider scripture reading in the church to be considered teaching, and this is why there is a question mark about whether we can or cannot have lay lectors. See, in the coelc, we have lay readers leading a service, but we don't permit lay people to preach a sermon, because that would be preaching and teaching, and Article 14 of the Augsburg Confession says that nobody should preach or teach in the church unless they are publicly called into the office of the ministry. But the Lutherans have always made this exception that lay people can speak in a position where it is not a teaching position. So this is why the early Lutherans in the Saxon Visitation article says that in the absence of a pastor, a lay person can get up and read the scripture readings for the day and sing hymns, because the Lutherans considered the basic reading of scripture to not be a teaching of scripture. If you're explaining the text in a sermon and you're giving an exposition on the text, whether you wrote that sermon or not, that would still be teaching on the text. But simply reading the text is just declaring what the text says. You're not teaching the text. And so the early Lutherans did not consider reading scripture to be necessarily teaching. This is also why the Church Order of Hoya said that in the absence of a pastor, the kuster or lay reader could lead the congregation in a recitation of Luther's catechism, because even though that might be a teaching and explanation of scripture, the lay person or the kuster isn't teaching, he's leading the recitation. So he asks the questions, he doesn't teach. He asks the questions, and then he joins in the rest of the congregation to explain the answers. And so this is like in the liturgical service, where the pastor will get up and he'll say things like, "Lord have mercy," and the congregation responds with, "Lord have mercy." The men and the women in the congregation are not teaching when they respond with, "Lord have mercy," even though they might be quoting scripture. When the congregation responds by singing the Song of Simeon or singing the Psalms or stuff like that, like for example in those churches that have a responsive psalm, the men and the women in the congregation, the laity, are responding with the words of scripture, but you wouldn't say they're teaching in that position. So simply reading the text is not necessarily teaching. And so this is why the question of lay lectors is left kind of as a bit of a question mark in the Lutheran Church. I would argue that if there is a pastor present, there should not be the use of lay lectors in the church, because it is the pastor's responsibility to read the scriptures and to teach on the scriptures. And so therefore, if a pastor can do it, the responsibility and the authority falls on him. And this is actually why this then actually addresses the question then as to why women can't be lay lectors. Because even though it is not a position of teaching and preaching, thus not a violation of 1 Corinthians 14, it is still a position of authority. A Kuster leading a lay reading service may not be preaching and teaching, but it is still a position of authority. Thus, a lay lector, while they may not be teaching, it is a position of authority. And so even though it's not a violation of 1 Corinthians 14 on women preaching and teaching in the church, it would still be a violation of 1 Timothy chapter 2, in which women are said not to have authority over men in the church. So the position of lay lector is still an authoritative position, which is why in the coelc we don't allow lay lectors, because if a pastor is present, he is the one who has the call of the congregation to stand in that authoritative position. And a lay lector is an authoritative position, therefore that position should go to the pastor. But when there is no pastor available, and you're talking about just lay men and lay women, that position then falls on the lay man and not on the lay women. So yes, during a lay reading service, we do in the coelc allow Kusters to read the Bible lessons, because it is not teaching. And since there is no pastor there, he is not stealing anyone's authority, but he is still standing in a position of authority, and therefore it should only be a man who does this. Therefore, there cannot be female lay lectors in the church, even though it is not a position of teaching. Now, for those who have read my book, you may know that I've kind of added in a bit of information that is not included in that book, and I've kind of actually not even looked at my script. I've kind of gone off on a tangent, but that is again because when I wrote that book, I wrote it in 2017 when I had different information available to me. I had limited information. I didn't know about the Saxon Visitation articles. I didn't know about the Church Order of Hoya, and I was very much influenced by the positions of the Lutheran Church of Australia and the Australian Evangelical Lutheran Church. And since then I have grown in my knowledge and wisdom, and I hold a different position on lay lectors to what I held at the time of writing that book. So for those reading the book, you might notice that this video is very different to what is actually written in the section of lay lectors in the book. But that's because that book is written from a period of ignorance, essentially, and I'm now better informed, and I am presenting in this video my current position on this matter. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.